Hello, and welcome everyone to our virtual workshop on the future of scientific conferencing. I'm Sydney O'Connor, co-chair of the planning committee for this event. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event hosted by the National Institutes of Health, Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, or OBSSR, and an NIH planning committee with support from the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, or COSWOD. As an OBSSR-hosted event, we require all participants to adhere to these guidelines. Participants must uphold the professional and educational purposes of this meeting by respecting the rights, views, privacy, safety, and dignity of all people, demonstrate professionalism, consideration, and respect in their speech and actions, keep all comments relevant to the event topic. Please refrain from engaging in harassing speech or inappropriate behavior, posting insulting, obscene, discriminatory, or threatening comments, or disrupting the conversation with spam or repetitive posts. Failure to adhere to these guidelines will result in removal from the event. You can refer to these guidelines at any time. They're linked on the event website. This workshop was planned by an NIH-wide planning committee with input and representation from several institutes, centers, and offices. Scientific conferencing is a vital aspect of our work as scientists. Scientific conferences and meetings provide key opportunities for training, dissemination of research, and networking. The COVID-19 pandemic led to rapid uptake of virtual approaches to scientific conferencing. Growing acceptance of hybrid work options highlights an opportunity to re-examine how scientific conferences are conducted. This virtual workshop aims to bring together diverse perspectives from multiple disciplines to explore advantages, barriers, gaps, and opportunities in the future of scientific conferencing for the behavioral and social sciences. We also hope to incorporate innovative approaches to showcase the potential of a virtual platform for learning, networking, and engagement. The overarching aims are to facilitate interdisciplinary communication and networking, identify cross-cutting scientific gaps regarding the role of behavioral and social science factors in scientific convenings, and to inform practical strategies for designing effective, engaging, and sustainable scientific conferences and meetings. Now I'll hand it over to Jessica to share more about today's agenda.
This workshop takes place over 3 days and highlights distinct themes as they relate to scientific convenings. Last week, we held Workshop Day 1 and Engagement Day, and you can access those on-demand recordings from Day 1 here in the LabRoots platform. Today is Workshop Day 2, and content will focus on themes of connection, engagement, technology, and innovation in relation to scientific conferences and meetings. Today, we're excited to highlight the themes of networking, collaboration, and scientific innovation in Track 3. Beyond sharing knowledge, scientific conferences and meetings have many other impacts for human connection and innovation. We will examine formal and informal networking approaches across conference formats, as well as how conferences and meetings can be a springboard for creativity and scientific innovation. Track 3, Session 1, Forging Social Connections, Formal and Informal Networking at Scientific Conferences. And Track 3, Session 2 will be on Catalysts of Innovation, exploring the impact of scientific convenings on knowledge sharing and idea diffusion. In Track 4, we will highlight themes of balancing participant needs and technology. Our modern scientific conference and meeting landscape provides multiple modalities for meeting, from in-person to hybrid to fully virtual. With increased options, there's an even greater need to understand the diverse perspectives and needs, from professional societies that plan conferences to early career individuals who attend them and everyone in between. Additionally, we will delve into some emerging technologies from advanced video conferencing tools to immersive virtual reality environments that provide new opportunities to engage and connect. Track 4, Session 1 will focus on building bridges, navigating diverse viewpoints and needs to optimize the conference experience. And Track 4, Session 2 will examine virtual frontiers, transforming conference experiences with immersive technologies. Over to you, Sydney.
Thank you. In addition to the content in the concurrent live tracks, please take advantage of the other features of this virtual event. In the networking lounge, you can find message boards and networking tools. You can also connect with us on social media. check out the poster hall to engage with pre-recorded poster presentations. You can also use the carbon calculator in the icon bar to calculate carbon emissions saved by attending virtually compared to an in-person workshop. On-demand recordings for live sessions will be posted within 24 hours. You can already access recordings from workshop day 1. Recordings are available to watch for 1 year within the LabRoots platform and will be later archived on the OBSSR website. A few words about navigating the virtual environment. You can view the welcome video in the virtual lobby at any time. Throughout the day, announcements will alert attendees of upcoming content. Virtual travel breaks have been built into the agenda. Live closed captions are provided for each session. Additionally, Q&A and chat functions are available in each live session. You can use the Q&A to submit questions directly to the moderator and presenters, and use the chat to share comments and reactions to the presentations, which will be seen by the full audience. Additionally, the help desk is staffed and available to assist with any technical questions or issues. Now, it's our pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Lauer, Deputy Director for Extramural Research at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Lauer will be providing today's welcome address. Dr. Lauer, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Sydney and Jessica. And I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this afternoon session and to thank OBSSR for putting together a fantastic conference. So I am pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Office of Extramural Research here at the NIH. I thought I'd start by telling a story. When I was a child in the 1960s, at some point, there was a major oil company, oil refinery fire. This fire was a rather devastating event, and it led to a scientific conference in San Francisco. One of the participants in that conference was my father. I was about 10 years old, and my father proposed something to me. He suggested, how would you like to come with me to San Francisco? And needless to say, I was very excited about that. I'd never been to San Francisco before. Of course, he told me I had to be well behaved, and I guess he thought that he could trust me that I would behave myself. So I went with him, and of course, we spent some father and son time going around the city and doing some tourist stuff. But I also had the opportunity to watch him in action at this conference. So this was a big conference. There were lots of people there, and my father gave at least one talk, maybe more. I remember being very proud of him, even though, of course, I had absolutely no clue what he was talking about. But I noticed how he seemed to be thoroughly enjoying himself, and all these people knew him, and there were lots of conversations going on, both during the formal meetings and perhaps more importantly during the informal meetings in the hallway. So that was my first impression of scientific conferencing. And I came away from that with some really fond memories. All right, now many years later, as a cardiology fellow, was perhaps the first time that I got to attend a major scientific conference on my own, so I attended the American College of Cardiology meetings, the American Heart Association meetings. These are gigantic affairs. Typically, they would have 20 or 30,000 people come. For many years during these meetings, I had the opportunity to present posters or give talks, and of course, also participate in a number of side meetings that were held because conveniently many people were going to be all there at the same place at the same time. These meetings were very enjoyable. And I think, putting together the experiences that I had at the oil refinery fire meeting when I was a kid, and then the many cardiology meetings that I went to, the themes that were just mentioned, networking, collaboration, and innovation, they were all there. These were to a large extent, that especially the networking and collaboration part, were to a large extent, there was a very large social component. This was something that I very much came to appreciate. But what I didn't so much appreciate were certain aspects of this phenomenon, which have only really become clear to me over the last few years. So one aspect of this, of course, is that it's a big deal to travel places. One of the reasons why I feel very comfortable doing this event right now is that I don't have to travel any place. I'm doing this in the comfort of my own office. And I had items on my schedule immediately before. I've got items on my schedule immediately after, and it's perfectly fine. There's no major inconvenience there. On the other hand, going to San Francisco, we lived in Philadelphia when I was a kid. Going to San Francisco was a really big deal. That took up a lot of time. And then similarly, the cardiology meetings, which were sometimes in California, sometimes in Dallas, sometimes in Atlanta, sometimes in Chicago, all of these meetings involve travel and involve lost time. And of course, certainly wasn't thinking about it at the time, but the travel would have meant a substantial carbon footprint. So that's one aspect is the inconvenience and the time of travel. But another aspect, perhaps more important or equally important, is that in order to participate in these kinds of conferences, you have to be a member of the club. Member of the club. So what does that mean? Well, one is that you have to be able to somehow afford to be able to go to the conference. Either your company pays for you, or your employer pays for you, or you can afford to pay for it on your own. And the other is that you're in a work situation where you're capable of going to a conference. Your employer is actually willing to let you go for a period of time to participate in a conference or to support you to do that. And that's something which I have to say I really did not appreciate until the last few years. So what's happened in the last few years? In April of 2020, we were having we were supposed to have one of our regional conferences. So the Office of Extramural Research at NIH, we sponsored two so-called regional seminars every year. One would be in the Washington, Baltimore area. One would be someplace else in the country. These were big deals. We would have 800 to 1,000 people come, and we would use these meetings to meet with grants administrators, scientists, and other people interested in the NIH grant process to talk about how the grant process works. I have to say I enjoyed these events enormously. And it was these were also, to a large extent, social events, as well as learning events. All right, April 2020, for obvious reasons, we were not able to have the conference. We saw this as a minor inconvenience because almost certainly the world would be back to normal before too long. But as the months went by and it was clear that we were not going to be able to host another conference that year, we decided to switch to a virtual format. And you've probably heard a bit about this already. I think Dr. Bernard included some information about this in her remarks. We had no idea how this was going to turn out. I have to say, I've got amazing colleagues who put this thing together. But we found that the extent of outreach that we were able to accomplish was orders of magnitude more than what we were doing before. We had tens of thousands, more than 10,000 people show up to the conferences. And what we also learned is that many people showed up to the conferences whom we otherwise would never have been able to touch because of the fact that they didn't have to pay a registration fee, they didn't have to travel, they could take up as much or as little time as they wanted to. They were able to come and participate in our event, hopefully learn from what we were able to teach. We were still able to set up a lot of networking opportunities, perhaps not quite as perfect as the in-person event, but nonetheless still quite effective. So I have to say that as time has gone on, we have come to appreciate the value of different kinds of conferences. I think another point, and this is where I'll conclude, is that the conference that I went to with my dad in San Francisco, it was a one big thing all at one time over a period of a few days, lots of people coming in all together. This is standard with conferences. This was certainly true with the cardiology conferences. There needed to be, there was a physical necessity why everybody had to be coming together all at the same time. But one of the things that we've discovered is that on a virtual platform, we're not necessarily wedded to that. And so in the past year or two, we've not only had our main conference virtually, but we've also set up what we call pre-conferences, which are smaller events, if you want to call it that. But this way, we're able to spread out events over time, not have to have a huge crunch of work all at one point in time, and actually reach an even larger audience than we could with the virtual conference. So conferences are a lot of fun. They were a lot of fun for me when I was 10 years old. They continue to be a lot of fun for me right now. Although, of course, obviously they have evolved a great deal in our digital and internet age. But I hope that these comments touching on the themes of networking, collaboration, innovation, saving the carbon footprint, and thinking about conferences as part of a social phenomenon, I hope that these were helpful and will get everyone in the right set of mind. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lauer, for that welcome address. Now we'd like to hand it over to Dr. Amit Mistry, Senior Scientist at the Fogarty International Center at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Mistry will be moderating the opening keynote presentation. Dr. Mistry, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sydney, for the introduction, and thank you to Dr. Lauer for setting the stage for today's session. Again, my name is Amit Mistry with the Fogarty Center at NIH, and I'm part of the planning committee that put this workshop together. And in our next session, we're going to hear a presentation from Andy Burnett, followed by some time for discussion and Q&A. And as a reminder to everyone in the audience, please use the Q&A function at any point in the session to add your questions for our presenter. And you're also welcome and encouraged to use the group chat to start a dialogue with each other as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Andy Burnett is the CEO of No Innovation Incorporated. It's a consulting firm that specializes in accelerating scientific innovation through deliberate creative approaches. Andy describes himself as a recovering academic. He has degrees in management science and creativity and change management. And he led a really interesting discussion in Friday's workshop that I hope some of you were able to join. He also has a long history, he and his organization have a long history of working with several different institutes across NIH. Today, the title of his talk is, "Oh, that's what you mean." Don't worry, he'll be explaining that shortly. With that, I'll hand the stage over to Andy.
Thank you, Amit. I don't think we're running described audio today, so for anyone who needs it, I'm a 60-year-old white male, I'm wearing a blue shirt, and I'm sitting behind a desk. Now, let me just make sure, yes, that looks hopeful. I want to start off by confessing my biases so that you can discount my opinions to the extent that you feel necessary. So when we set up our company, which was a long time ago now, we decided right from the start that we wanted to be fully virtual. So we've spent 20 odd years or longer really experimenting with lots of different virtual platforms. In fact, when we started, I'm not even sure Skype was around. But I am a big fan of virtual collaboration. It has been hugely important to me and my colleagues, and it's influenced my thinking a great deal. That does not mean it is appropriate or the best approach in all situations, but you will find I sort of cleave in that direction. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as an organization, my colleagues and I are all fascinated by the psychology of creativity, and we are always interested in new and strange ideas, and that shapes the way we work and the sort of events that we run. Again, that is only part of why one might have scientific meetings, but that's the part that we're particularly interested in. So that's my bias around here. I also want to highlight the fact that I'm going to be talking about things that some of them we are experimenting with now. Some of them we are hoping to get to. And what I'm hoping is that some of these ideas might resonate, that you might go and try experiments, and that we can really start to have an interesting conversation around this. I think there are a lot of people registered for this conference, and I'm really hoping it starts a community of people who would like to explore further. So, just see if I advance that. Why do we have scientific meetings? Now, I became interested in this question particularly as we were coming out of the pandemic. And although it's a general question about scientific meetings, which have obviously been going on for hundreds of years, I was particularly interested in why a subset of people were so keen to go back to face meetings, where I had found our virtual meetings to be astonishingly effective. So I was curious about that not everyone shared my enthusiasm. And so I started asking people about that. Now, I suspect the most honest answers that I got from people were, this is how I collect the air miles that allows me to take my family on holiday to Cancun. And we know from research in economics that air miles and frequent flyer points are remarkably powerful in terms of shaping people's behavior. But over and above that, I started getting some interesting responses, and I picked out a few of them because they sort of highlight different aspects that I think we need to think about if we want to talk about the future of scientific meetings. They've been picked up from different sources, some from conversations, some from things that I read on Twitter, which struck me as interesting. So this first one, which was in fact from the director of a clinical and translational medicine center, I thought was really interesting. He said, conferences get me away from email and distractions. And he described this more fully by saying he liked to go away to conferences and just sort of immerse himself in the content. And when we talked about this a little further, and subsequent conversations I've had with other people, it really highlighted for me that this sort of virtual collaboration is good, but it's really emphasized the fact that we are not great at doing time management. And in particular, we are not great at being able to give ourselves the sort of chunks of time that attending a face-to-face conference enforces upon us. Now, there may be good reasons why we actually don't need those chunks of time. Perhaps we can be massively more efficient, but we do need to recognize that at least for a subset of the people who may be interested in attending conferences, it's not just about the delivered content. It's about a justifiable time management strategy. And I think this is important. Another thing that I heard a lot was it's all about the impromptu hallway conversations that I have. So the sort of unexpected social interactions. And this has been a refrain for a long time, that's what's really important about conferences. And this has always struck me as really interesting, because if that is the really important part of conferences, our conference design is rubbish. We should be completely changing the way we do conferences, and I will come back to that. But I just wanted to highlight, if that is what people really value in conferences, we should be designing for that outcome, and that might completely change the way we do things. I then saw a couple of other tweets which came in quick succession, and which I think both amused me and illuminated my thinking. There's a Twitter account called, I think it's Fly Less or Fly Less Carbon. It was set up by geoscientists, and they were trying basically to reduce the footprint around academic research. And I think this was in a thread with that. So one person had written that she, in this case, had said, I have small children. I don't want to attend conferences. And I thought, yep, that makes very great sense. And then someone else relatively soon after said, I have small children. I need to attend conferences. And for any of you who have had or still have small children, you can probably resonate with both of those points of view. But again, to me, it highlighted the different reasons why conferences and meetings might be important. And then this final one, which says, it's a sort of play on this meeting could have been an email, but in this case, it's this meeting could have been a YouTube presentation at double speed. And I'm very conscious of the fact I don't speak particularly quickly. You could, and perhaps you are, listening to this at double speed. And so I am, in some ways, wasting half of your time. Now, these different thoughts, I think, need to be accommodated into how we think about conferences. And I wanted to then build on that and go back to this idea, my bias, to be able to say, why do my colleagues and I think we have scientific meetings? And the idea for us is we want to stimulate innovation through interesting and unusual conversations. So it's a very specific look at this, in that because we're so interested in the creativity inherent in science and scientific meetings, we're really looking to say, how might we design events that cause people to go, I had the most interesting conversation, and here is my new idea. So the first thing that I wanted to suggest, and this is why this was subtitled Maps, Models and Simulations, is if you want to have stimulating conversations with unusual people, and you are at a conference of any size at all, you've got this first question, which is, how do I find the most interesting person at this event? And we've been pondering this for a while because of the kind of events we run. This is a question that we wrestled with. Most expertise locators are built around the idea of, how do I find someone with a particular set of knowledge, or how do I find my tribe, the people who are like me, be they cardiologists or architects. We realized we wanted to do the opposite. And when we were thinking about this, our thinking was, we're looking for people that know things that we don't know, or that I don't know, but they're still interested in the same questions. So we've all come together, say, for this meeting, around the questions of how might we improve scientific meetings, but they're bringing very different perspectives, and the chances are we don't know them. So the meeting that I was helping to run on Friday, the breakout session, we had a most interesting group of people from many different perspectives. That's exactly what I find exciting, and that feeds this idea of stimulating and interesting conversations. How do we do this in bigger and bigger meetings? Now, the problem is we have a challenge here, that people are complex and multifaceted. So how do we really know someone? Even if we get people to describe themselves in the proceedings, are we all using the same language? Are you using a terminology that I would understand? And when you say, I am a microcellular biologist, I happen to know that that would be within the field of biology because it's got biologist in there. But a lot of the ways that we might describe ourselves don't give me an insight into the hierarchy. And that might not initially seem important, except for the fact that I'm looking for the person least like me. So I need some appreciation of, are you an engineer, or are you an architect, or are you a something else? So being able to have structure in our descriptions is actually very helpful. So we were noodling on this, and we started trying out some experiments. Now, the slide that you've got on screen here might have text that is too small to read. That is okay. I will describe what you are looking at. So we started off by saying, how might we classify people who were attending a meeting? Unfortunately, the National Academies had developed a taxonomy, which interestingly they've now taken down from their website, but it gave some sort of structure. And so we started using it to invite people to say, what do you know? And where might this live in the tree, so that we get some sort of understanding of who you are? It's hierarchical, and it's also limited in detail, because again, I just need to know that you are in built environment and I'm in computer science to know that we are different. I don't need to know exactly what you're doing, potentially. So this started to give us a foothold into how might we know the most interesting person in this meeting. But because of the fact that people are multifaceted, it became increasingly difficult to navigate this space. And that's when we came across the work of Stephen Kuberoff, who, along with colleagues, a computer scientist at University of Arizona. And he had done some really interesting work. He was an attendee at a meeting we were running, where he was taking people's musical tastes as expressed in their Spotify playlists and compressing them down so that they looked a bit like a map. And what we've got on the right-hand side of the screen might look like an overview of perhaps a whole collection of counties within a country. But the structure here has meaning. And what it's actually telling us is that in this case, it's bringing together people's preferences musically and showing them in this geographical layout. He's collapsing high dimensional space into, I've got down here 2-ish dimensions, because not only is there a sort of X and Y position, but he's also got colors on there. So it's showing that even though some regions may be separated geographically, there are still connections. Now, we were fascinated by this because in Stephen's work, he was showing clusters, what is similar. But it suddenly occurred to us that we could do the opposite around this. And somebody who is a long way away from wherever you are on the map should, in theory, be interesting to you. They are very different from you, but we're all at the same event. So we started playing with this. And I think that's jumped forward. And we discovered that the maps were interesting, but as it said, all maps are wrong. Some maps are interesting because it allowed for this second layer of conversations. We would take people's expressed interests, we would throw them into a map, and then we would invite people to say, are you actually in the right place in the map? Or are you somewhere different? And if you are more over to one side or another, tell us about why that is, because there are aspects of you that we would like to know more about. So that was one thing. It gave people a chance to say, am I similar? Am I different from you? And it proved to be a really interesting conversational structure. The other thing was when people started saying, yes, we are all in the right place, it allowed us to then actually get them to say, and who do you connect with and how do you connect? And when we have time, we also invite these groups to come up with their national anthem and perform it for us, which is always a source of great amusement to us. But it allows us then to have a map of who is here, what they're interested in, and how similar or different they are from us. So I would like to have or propose that future conferences should not just produce a participant list, but we should have some sort of participant map as well, so that I can go to someone and say, I think you will be very interesting to me, and this is the reason why. We're very different, but we're all here around a similar problem. There is much more to be done on this, but I think we could do this, and I think mapping our participants would be fascinating. So, if we have managed to map people and you've managed to find interesting, or perhaps the most interesting person in the conference to talk with, we then run into this second problem, which is, do we really understand what we're each saying? We were running an event, this is quite a few years ago now, but it was about the intersection between the biology of evolution and the mathematics of evolution. So it was at this intersection. And I happened to be listening to a conversation that a couple of people were having. And after a moment, one of them said, we're both using the term vector, but we are using it in very different ways. And this idea of language and what it means to us and how we use it is really important if we're going to have interesting conversations. And for that, I think models in some situation are more interesting and more important than papers. Now, clearly we want to read the methods section and see your references and all the rest of it. But if I'm trying to understand how you are seeing the world, I think models are remarkably powerful for doing this. They help us take our thinking and make it visible. They allow us to connect different perspectives because we can point to these models. And they also, when you're building a model, it helps you transcend jargon because you're pointing and you say, no, the circular bit over here, that represents whatever it is. One of my colleagues is very keen on taking an approach which he refers to as build to think, which is this idea that you show someone what you're thinking by working together and building models. Now, Patty Gravitt over at Global Health in NIH was kind enough. Do not worry about trying to read this model, but this is a model that she and colleagues have put together with regards to understanding smoking cessation and the various factors that might drive and accelerate or inhibit people's smoking activities. When I saw that, I don't fully understand it. So models like this can still be too complicated, but I could see that we would be able to have a conversation and that Patty could walk me through her thinking about what drives what. And I might be able to introduce elements of how I model the situation. And we could then look at, are our structures compatible? If not, why not? So building models is powerful, but it's also quite difficult depending on your background and what you were trained in. Many people aren't actually trained to build models in the same way that we are trained to write. And when we do invite people to build models, there is an issue about levels of abstraction. At what level is your model operating? And if I were to try and connect it with my model, are we actually at the right level? Outside of disciplines, perhaps like architecture or some aspects of computer science, do we even have a standard way of talking about things? But we could address this. We could develop in the same way that, say, in computer science, we have something called UML, Unified Modeling Language. There are different ways that we could actually work on being able to build models. I have mentioned a theory here, personal construct theory, which is something I'm very keen on as a way of eliciting from people, how do you actually think about a situation? And I encourage you, if you want to know more about that, personal construct theory can be interesting. Also, I've got a slide here that Cara Hall, who was moderating the session, or one of the sessions following on this, was kind enough to share. She has done quite a lot of work on events that are around cancer and healthcare behaviors. And this picture just shows what happens when we get a group of researchers together to actually co-create models and also to be able to talk about how our models fit together. I think this is an underused approach. I'm going to be coming back to this picture actually slightly later. But I've got as a proposal, I think we should at least try to have future conference proceedings include models and to actually start getting people to say, this is my model, and possibly even this was my model before I did the research, this is my model now, and this is how my thinking of the models has evolved. Now, models are great, but they're static and the world is dynamic. So if I go back to thinking about Patty's model about smoking cessation and the factors that drive that, I need to be able to interact with models more to really be able to test my understanding around that. And so that's where we get into the idea of we need to go beyond models. We actually need to go to simulations. We need to simulate our models. We need to energize them so that we can learn to understand them through interaction. And we need to be able to then compare our simulations with observed realities And we need to be able to do things like take a simulation and do something which is very common in the open source software world, which is to fork it and remix it. And so, okay, I see your base model. I'd like to tweak it in these different ways. And that might then allow me to be able to contribute back to your model, your simulation, I'm sorry, and be able to say, I have seen a different version. What do we think about this? Now, I've just got a couple of bullet points down here, one about Harmony Horizon, the other about Ozempic. And Harmony Horizon, this goes back to Patty Gravitz and Global Health, was an initiative or an attempt in a workshop that we were running to get people to tell us a story by building, in this case, sort of sketching on paper, a sort of simulation of what a future state for cancer healthcare disparities might look like. And it was really interesting. People came up with beautiful and different ways of saying this is what the future would look like. And we need to be able to model those in a more dynamic way. So I just touch on this as I sort of have this tenuous grasp on, I could see how we might do that. And the Ozempic I put down here, just because I've been reading a fascinating book about Ozempic. And as I was learning more about it, there were more and more aspects to a model that were just filling my mind. There were economic issues, there were socio-political issues, there were many different ways of thinking about the impact of this one type of drug. And I really wanted to capture this as some sort of simulation. Now, the problem with this, of course, is simulations are hard to build. If we thought models were difficult, then simulations might be even harder. But the reason that I'm coming back to this slide from Cara with the researchers looking at models is I think there are ways we might do this. And I've mentioned here something called dynamic land. Do not worry that you can't necessarily see what's going on in the little pictures there, because what dynamic land is, it's an attempt by a computer science researcher called Brett Victor to actually build what he calls a shareable or a collaborative, community computer. And what he's doing there is he is taking static 2D models and he's combining that with computer cameras that are in the ceiling and computer projectors. And you can move tangible objects around the table, and the computer sees those, understands them, and projects lines, connections. It basically takes static aspects and makes them dynamic. I mention it purely because it's an example of the sort of thing we might be able to do. And as our AI tools get better, I think we will see more of this kind of fusion of the tangible and the computer assisted ways of actually building and interacting with simulations. So I'm suggesting that future conferences should require all presenters to contribute their simulation to a conference-wide simulation. And if we were able to do that for this conference as an example, I think that would be fascinating. I would love to know how you might change the weights or adapt a simulation, and for me to be able to explore it and talk with you about how are you modeling this and why do you feel it's weighted in this way, whatever it is we're talking about. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is easy, but I can see how we could do it. And if we could, then you imagine that the product of this, the proceedings, becomes so much more powerful. So I'm going to draw it to a close here, and I'm going to frame this as an opportunity for questions and thoughts rather than questions and answers. I can promise that I have answers, but I would be delighted to talk about possibilities. Amit, back to you.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was a really excellent talk and really exciting ideas about improving the connectivity and the engagement in the future of scientific conferencing. And to our audience, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to add your questions, and then please use the group chat to add your thoughts or comments about some of the ideas that Andy shared with us. And maybe to kick things off while the audience is thinking about some questions, Andy, a question for you. Some of the ideas you mentioned around maps and models and simulations, some of them seem more easier to implement in a virtual meeting versus an in-person meeting, or vice versa. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what you see as, or how your advice or how these suggestions differ in the virtual versus in-person world of scientific meetings.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point in terms of when we're working virtually. I think there is an expectation about some level of technology which allows you to engage, and we can therefore say to people, we're going to be capturing our thoughts in Google Docs, or there is a website here. And there's even an understanding that probably you're sitting at a desk. It probably doesn't matter if you talk with other people via your Zoom connection, because hopefully you're somewhere where you're not irritating your colleagues. If we're talking about a physical environment, we can't necessarily guarantee that. And so I think if we want to up our level of interaction in our scientific conferences, we may have to rethink, where are we going to run them? And this has been a really interesting question, where we have been invited to run hybrid events. And we have run a number of these. And so far, our conclusion is hybrid only works well as a quality experience for everyone if the virtual participants work with virtual and the physical work with physical, and every so often we engineer sort of interfaces between these two worlds. But there's no reason it has to be like that. It just would mean that the venue that we choose has to support a much higher quality of interaction. And so you could imagine situations where rooms are designed to support physical and virtual interaction equally, that we've already worked and solved the problems of, if I'm writing on a particular surface, everyone who's in the virtual space can not just see it, but can collaborate with it. And that's why I was quite intrigued by Brett Victor's work on dynamic land, because even though he is very much in favor of everyone be together physically, you could imagine a situation where we had satellite pods, and that what was happening in one location is broadcast and projected onto the physical spaces in other locations. It's the sort of thing that you would imagine universities and research centers could set up reasonably easily. So I think we have to accommodate or incorporate that in our thinking about face-to-face events. I also think that we might want to build into our events the point that when you arrive, at a physical event, we hand you your iPad that says, or whatever device you want, that says, actually, this event is happening at multiple layers. Yes, there's a physical side to it, but you also need your device to be able to see the augmented layers on top of that. I hesitate to suggest that we give everyone Apple Vision Pro headsets, but if we did that just as a thought experiment, it would be fascinating to say, what would this look like? How might it highlight most interesting person over there, or the ways in which conversations are progressing? So I think we really need to do the experiments about what is the price of entry to be able to get this equally good experience, whether you're physically or virtually co-located.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point and a really important challenge. I encourage the audience to please add more to the Q&A or to the group chat. There is a comment from Cassandra about the important question that we all have to ask ourselves of why we're having the conference. What do we want people to get out of the conference, and how important it is to really determine what type of format works and what type of format doesn't work, and kind of building on your the concept of these simulations. Are there particular types of where do you see that fitting in the spectrum of the various different purposes people have for a meeting? What is that? What is a simulation most helpful towards getting the audience towards? If that makes sense.
So yeah, so I think from our point of view, our interest is really helping people understand perspectives which are very different from theirs. So being able to understand how a historian might think about opioid abuse or misuse versus how a ER doctor might think about this is really interesting. There's been, and we have run events where we've had that sort of distance in terms of participants. And it's fascinating because it takes quite a long time for different types of participants, depending on their training, to really understand, how do you think about truth? How does this work? What are you seeing as really significant in your model for explaining behavior? And so I think in some ways, building models and simulations is really useful for people to be able to look at it and go, I do not understand what you are saying. And you go, brilliant. That is our first stop. Years and years ago, when I was an undergrad, I was studying computer science and management, and I had a friend who was an English major. And I noticed on her desk one day that she had an exam question, which was compare and contrast the treatment of nature and nurture in Gwain and the Green Knight. And I looked at it and I said, I understand all those individual words, but that question just makes no sense to me whatsoever. And from that, we had a fascinating conversation about what it meant and how she saw the world and that sort of thing. So there is, build me a model so that I can see how different we are. And then the idea of the simulation as being able to say, how might your model interconnect and influence me? Um, and that allows us to then come up with this sort of almost transdisciplinary approach of being able to say, what's between our two worldviews? What is it that could connect? And what would that new model look like? And I think we'll see this if we zoom in on conversations, particularly around Ozempic, just because it's I said, a new and interesting way of thinking about it, to say, how are we all thinking about this?
Yeah. No, thank you. That's really helpful. And I see a question came in from Andrea Gokas. I really like the map idea. However, I wonder whose responsibility is it to incorporate it? Large meetings are often run by companies. In her organization, the meetings tend to be smaller and organized by people in the community. So I guess the question for you is, do you think it's easy to learn how to create these maps and how to obtain the data for it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so our process was fully automated, but in order to be able to do this, and I do realize it looks very complicated, it's actually not that difficult, but there are some things that we would need to agree upon. And the first is our taxonomy. And one of the things that we found particularly interesting is, if I'm a computer scientist and you're an architect and someone else is a choreographer, who is most different from me? So you can imagine it's not difficult to do similarity, but over a certain level, you go, are you equally different? Which could be great. I'll talk with both of you, but given limited amount of time, if we're really after the people from whom we might learn the most, we need this way of being able to understand and categorize people's interest. And so one of the things, we haven't done this yet, but one of the things we're interested in would be to be able to go back to people's terminal degrees and say, tell us about the subjects you learned, because it may be that you are a much more quantitative person than your current state sort of would necessarily suggest to me, and that might make you closer or further away. So we need a taxonomy. And then if you go back to, say, Stephen Kuberoff's work, he's published all of his software around there. And he has a tool called GMAP, which sort of creates that kind of map. So it's not too difficult. We can do this. And if we could just get used to being able to say, this is what I know in some sort of standard way, we can start to build maps of communities.
Well, Andy, we're just about out of time, so I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the conference organizers and the audience. Thank you for a really insightful session. I know I took away some ideas of how to improve future meetings that I'm involved in. So thank you again for a really insightful presentation, and thank you to the audience for your questions and comments. This concludes our plenary session, and we're now going to move into a short break. The next set of concurrent sessions will begin about 1:15 Eastern Time. And for those in the audience, you'll have the choice of 2 concurrent sessions or tracks. Track 3 is focused on forging social connections, formal and informal networking at scientific conferences. And track 4 is focused on building bridges, navigating diverse viewpoints and needs to optimize conference experience. And when it's time to join those sessions, you'll go into the auditorium, select the track you want to attend, and click on the small play button as you did to join this session here. So thank you all again, and see you soon.